Greetings and shalom, VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this video report. Freedom! This has been one of the most momentous weeks in modern Israeli history as the last remaining living hostages who were kidnapped by Hamas on October 7, 2023 have been released, and it looks like the kinetic battle in Gaza is over for now. President Trump touched down in Israel for the shortest visit ever by a sitting U.S. president before heading to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for a regional summit. All that and much more is just ahead on VFI News from Israel. The big event this week is, of course, the release of the hostages and the visit by President Donald J. Trump. But that was preceded by the arrival in Israel of Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, as well as the president's daughter, Ivanka, and son-in-law, Jared Kushner. They all addressed the weekly rally in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv on Saturday evening. It was probably the largest rally ever held in that venue, with some estimates putting the crowd at over 500,000. That's why I stayed home, because I could see more on TV. Well, anyhow, Witkoff told the crowd, "I have dreamed of this moment," while Ivanka said that her father always sees the suffering of the innocent and is working constantly to relieve that suffering. The crowd roared its approval of these words, and also pretty much every time President Trump's name was mentioned, the crowd cheered. But sadly, whenever the name of Prime Minister Netanyahu was mentioned, loud boos were heard. This is deeply illogical and perhaps even absurd, but one should not be surprised. That's Israeli politics for you. Now, after 2 years of war during which Netanyahu has presided over the triumphant defeat and beating back of some of the most deadly threats to Israel since the founding of the state, it all comes down to this. The process of returning these hostages was taking a long time, too long for their families and supporters and for many people in Israel. That was all that mattered in the end. They have quickly forgotten about all the other things that went right for Israel in this war, which Netanyahu can and should be credited for. Well, to make a brief comment on that, Israeli society has long been fractured along political, cultural, economic, and religious lines. The rally around the flag effect that we saw when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, followed a period of high tensions over the issue of judicial reform, which seems like something from a different lifetime now. But even before that, Benjamin Netanyahu is probably one of the most polarizing figures in Israeli history. There are those who love him and those who love to hate him, but there's hardly anyone in the middle anymore. For that matter, he's hardly the first Israeli political figure who had to face this dynamic. In the aftermath of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan were both pilloried in the media and by large swaths of the general public. Now, this was unfair and candidly somewhat insane, but Meir herself said it didn't surprise her much. After all, as she and others pointed out, the children of Israel who saw God strike the Egyptians with 10 plagues to free them from bondage, part the Red Sea, appear as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night to protect and nurture them, still complained and were not grateful. Personally, I don't think this is unique to the Jewish people. I'm Jewish too. I've observed it in pretty much every nation, tongue, tribe, and people group all over the world. It is part of the aptly named human nature, but that's not much help in the current situation, is it? On that note, it should probably also surprise no one that a recent poll said that now that hostilities in Gaza have ended, Netanyahu should resign immediately and we need to have new elections in Israel as soon as possible. Why, I certainly agree to some extent with the second part, but maybe it's not the time. We are almost at the end of this Knesset's 4-year mandate in any case, and the people of Israel certainly do need to have a fresh chance to make their voices heard. There are a lot of issues to consider in the upcoming elections that were not on the table the last time around. And there's several people who are in the current Knesset who probably won't be in the next one. And by the way, Netanyahu's poll is just going up, in my opinion. Well, the polls all say that the Israeli people do want to make some changes, and many things are on the table that were never there before. So it's going to be an interesting next few months and years, and here at VFI News, we will be reporting on all of this going forward. You can bet your bottom there. Be sure to give us a like, share these videos on social media, share it throughout the broadcast, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an update. Now moving on, the 20 living hostages were handed over by Hamas to the Red Cross on Monday morning, while the remains of some of those were murdered in captivity were handed over some hours later. The names of the living hostages are Elkanah Bochbot, Matan Angrest, Avinatan Or, Yosef Chaim Ohana, Elon Ohel, Eviatar David, Guy Gilboa Dalal, Ram Breslavsky, Gali Berman, Ziv Berman, Eitan Moore, Segev Kalfon, Nimrod Cohen, Maxim Herkin, Eitan Horn, Matan Zangaukor, Bar Kuberstein, David Cunio, Ariel Cunio, and Omri Miran. Now, I know many of you have been praying for these hostages by names for many months, and I want to personally take a moment to thank every one of you who has done so and who has supported Israel and VFI in other ways. I know we've all waited for this moment, and we're overjoyed to tears and laughter and happiness to get these last hostages back almost exactly 2 years after they were kidnapped on October 7th, 2023. By the way, on the Hebrew calendar, the day these hostages finally came home is the eve of Simchat Torah, which, in case you forgot, was the high holy day that Israelis were planning to celebrate on October 7th, 2023. That is the day that these people were kidnapped, and some would say that there is prophetic significance to their returning to Israel on the evening of this same high holy day 2 years later. It certainly is auspicious, and I invite you to share your thoughts about this in the comments section. Write me at info@visionforisrael.com. I'm sure many people will have something to say about this. However, I am sorry to have to say so, but this war, in my opinion, is not over, despite what President Trump has done for Israel in the Middle East. And we'll talk more about him and his historic visit to Jerusalem in a moment. There is some hope now that the kinetic phase of this round of conflict in Gaza might be over. There is also a good chance that tens of thousands of IDF reservists might finally be able to go home and start to rebuild their lives. But there are already indications that things could heat up again very quickly on other fronts. For that matter, wars end when both sides say they're over, and Hamas is not ready to say it's over yet. In fact, they and their supporters in countries all over the world are loudly declaring that they have not been defeated and are in fact just getting started. In the north, the IDF hit a park in Lebanon over the last week that was full of earth-moving equipment that Hezbollah had, very foolishly, assembled for the purpose of rebuilding some of the infrastructure that Israel destroyed last September. Despite all the fine-sounding words from the internationally recognized government of Lebanon, which demanded that Hezbollah disarm, Hezbollah has called their bluff, and it is becoming obvious to everyone that the LNA, the Lebanese National Army, doesn't have what it takes to force the issue. Iran is doing everything it can to rearm and reorganize Hezbollah so it can continue to be a threat to Israel's northern border. And some intelligence estimates say that Hezbollah has already rebuilt about 30% of the inventory of rockets and missiles it lost last autumn. Well, it'll take time to recruit and train new crews to be ready to fire all those weapons, and there are a lot of other things that Hezbollah will need to do before it could be ready to start something with Israel again. Israel is not, by any means, watching passively while they rebuild, and last week's strike on the earth-moving equipment park is an example of what the IDF continues to do in this regard. But the bottom line is that while Hezbollah is down, they're not out, and they will continue to be a problem going forward. Israel will need to remain vigilant on the northern border, and although I'm sure the efforts to push the Lebanese state and army to seriously confront Hezbollah, at this point, I don't think it would be wise to rely on them for much. Now, next door, who's at that door? In Syria, we remain close, but so far no cigar, to a long-term security pact with the al-Jolani regime. But for now, IDF troops remain deployed in southern Syria. Turkish troops remain deployed in northern Syria, and they are separated by a fairly thin strip of territory, which is under the very loose and fragile control of forces which no one can be sure who or what they're loyal to from one day to the next. Al-Jolani himself has backing from France, the United States, and some of the moderate Sunni states. He is also fiercely opposed by Iran, not seen very favorably by Turkey, and there are lots of people in Russia and China looking at him with a very strange look in their eyes, which personally makes me very nervous. In short, the circumstances in Syria could change very drastically and also very quickly. And there is no way, Jose, no way to even guess what would happen to Israel's position in Syria if al-Jolani were certainly to be out of the picture, which is a much stronger possibility than most people realize, in my humble opinion. Of course, on top of all that, there is also the Houthis in Yemen, who have denounced the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas and vowed to continue to harass Israel in any way they can. This includes the ability they've demonstrated to launch both ballistic missiles as well as long-range drones at us, and also continue to blockade the southern Israeli port of Eilat. Now, for all these reasons, people, Vision for Israel is continuing our efforts to provide portable bomb safety shelters to Israeli communities, as well as equipment and training to frontline teams, including medical first responders, firefighters, the police, ambulances, and anyone else who needs our help. So please watch this short video about these ongoing efforts. After October 7th, 2023, which was considered the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, security teams were devastated along the southern border of Israel. From October 8th onwards, also Hezbollah in Lebanon, a terror group, also attacked in the northern part of Israel. Security teams turned to Vision for Israel for extra aid and help, and many of the items that we provided were ceramic vests for security teams to avoid bullet wounds as well as shrapnel wounds. We also needed to provide proper helmets. Most of these security teams had outdated equipment that hadn't been replaced in decades. In addition to that, there was a request for medic bags and defibrillators and for all sorts of medical disposables that were needed. Then, as a result of these rocket attacks, also fires were erupting, and so we were requested to provide firefighting equipment and generators and protective clothing in order to put out these fires. And so Vision for Israel is very happy to come alongside the civilian security teams, the community security teams. We even bought a new police vehicle for one of the southern cities and dedicated it together with the mayor. It was in the city of Sderot, which was badly hit during the first days of the war, and the requests keep coming in, and we will continue to keep providing. Welcome back, friends. Now, the second half of this week's report will, of course, be devoted to the short but very significant visit of U.S. President Donald J. Trump to Jerusalem on Monday. As he emerged from Air Force One on the tarmac of Ben Gurion International Airport, President Trump was greeted by a long line of Israeli officials, as well as U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee, Witkoff, Jared, and Ivanka. And of course, at the head of this line was none other than Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife Sarah, along with President Isaac Herzog. President Trump told these two men, as he warmly greeted them, that, quote, "It's a great day, maybe your best day," unquote. Huckabee also declared while greeting Netanyahu on the tarmac that, quote, his unflinching leadership against so much opposition was key to end the war and hostage release. Mike Huckabee disagrees with those who were booing Netanyahu in Hostage Square on Saturday evening. And for what it's worth, I think Mike Huckabee is correct. From the airport, President Trump and the other U.S. and Israeli officials moved to the Knesset in Jerusalem, where President Trump signed the guest book saying, "This is my great honor, a great and beautiful day, a new beginning." For the next half hour or so, President Trump took questions from the media and then moved to a meeting with former hostages and their families. That went on for a short time, and then everyone moved into the Knesset chamber for the speeches by the leaders. The first to address the meeting was Knesset Speaker Amir Ohana, who praised Trump effusively, maybe even extravagantly, including the quote, which I'm sure a lot of American Jews heard and cringed at, when he said, "The world needs more Trumps." Well, I have relatives in America who probably threw something heavy through their TV screens, God forbid, when they heard that, or maybe they just buried their face in their hands and cried. But in any case, I'm sure it didn't set well with them. But with me and Batya, it set very well. As soon as Ohana finished up, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech, and he spoke in English out of respect for President Trump and the other American guests. His speech was classic Bibi, and once again it was filled with praise for President Trump and the tremendous support he has given Israel in this war. Like Ohana, Netanyahu said that President Trump deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, and like Ohana, he said he was sure next year the prize would go to him. Netanyahu also gave credit to the IDF soldiers, pointed out a severely wounded soldier who had lost 3 limbs in battle and telling him that he was the Spirit of David. He also praised those who had fought the information war, including the mother of a hostage who was murdered on October 7th, who went all over the world raising awareness of Hamas's crimes. As soon as Netanyahu was done speaking, chants of "Trump, Trump, Trump" sounded in the chamber. But before the president could begin, there was one more speech by opposition leader Yair Lapid. He did great, in my humble opinion, addressing those who had protested against Israel around the world and telling them that they had been deceived into believing things about Israel that simply weren't true. Bravo, Yair Lapid. In my humble opinion, more Israeli politicians should give speeches like that and bring up this point every chance they get. Finally, it was time for the main event as President Trump stood at the podium and began his speech, which would go on for over an hour, by giving thanks at the beginning to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was a great way to get things started. But here's some of the highlights from my perspective. So let me just encourage you all to watch the entire speech for yourself if you can. He speaks slow enough so you can hear it very clearly. Now, after his strong opening, President Trump said that, quote, after so many years of war and danger, the skies are calm today, the cannons are silent, and the sun is shining on the Holy Land. This isn't only the end of the war, it's the end of an era of terror and death. Like in the United States, this will be the golden age of Israel and of the Middle East. The hostages have returned. It feels so good to say that. He went on to say that Israel has achieved all it can through military force. Now is the time to translate those achievements against terrorists on the battlefield into the ultimate reward of peace and prosperity throughout the Middle East. Wonderful words. He also gave credit to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for his leadership of Israel during the last 2 years of war. And he also made a very bold statement to the entire Israeli people that this war is over and it's time to look ahead to the next step. He even said that Iran would be welcome to join in a regional framework once it stops supporting terrorism and pursuing nuclear weapons. But he also bragged on the U.S. Air Force for launching Operation Midnight Hammer to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities during the 12-day war in June. Other highlights of the speech included an acknowledgement that getting along with Netanyahu was not always easy, but as President Trump said, that's what makes him great. He added later in the speech that the reason Netanyahu is so popular is because he knows how to win. Well, President Trump also had something to say to the Palestinians, that they now, quote, have an opportunity to turn away forever from the path of violence and terror and to push back the forces of evil from amongst them. After so much death and pain, this is their time to focus on building stability, security, dignity, and economic development so that they will finally have the good lives their children deserve, unquote. He added, quote, "We have seen how nations that put aside their differences are now the most prosperous in the region and get along great with Israel. It is now clearer than ever that the responsible nations of the region need not be enemies, but partners, even friends," unquote. He also urged the Palestinians to build something positive for themselves and stop putting their efforts into tearing down what Israel has built. I am personally very glad he said that. I also think it's long past time for this to be the message that the Palestinian Arabs hear from everyone, from their friends in Qatar and Turkey to the governments of Western countries, all the professors at universities in Western countries that say they love the Palestinians so much, etc., etc. So if you love the Palestinians so much, tell them the truth, that they'll never build a positive future for themselves with hate, contempt, and violence. President Trump's speech was a watershed moment in Israeli history, as it has already provided an opportunity for this war to end. But as I said before, there are reasons to worry that nothing is over. Hamas is flatly refusing to disarm, and it can be presumed that they will also refuse to give up power in the Strip, which was part of the 20 or 21-point plan that President Trump proposed and Hamas and Israel both agreed to. In fact, far from disarming and preparing to give up power, in just the first 48 hours after the IDF has pulled back from Gaza City and other areas in the Strip, Hamas has come out of the tunnels and is reasserting control in many areas. It is also taking revenge on those who it says collaborated with Israel over the past 2 years. That includes pretty much anyone who did anything that Hamas doesn't like, and it also includes other armed factions, gangs, and clans that have expressed the desire for Hamas to no longer be the sovereign power in the Strip. Clashes between Hamas gunmen and these other armed factions have already broken out, leading to heavy casualties on all sides. Now, the IDF was assisting some of these militias prior to the ceasefire, but now with the partial withdrawal, that's not as possible. So Hamas is reportedly taking the opportunity to wipe out all of its rivals. It's a very ugly and bloody situation, and I doubt any of these people who have been screaming about an Israeli genocide in the Strip for the past 2 years will raise one finger to do anything about it. Well, on that note, it's also worth mentioning that those who have been screaming about famine in the Strip need to explain why the UN admitted this week that they've got more than enough food available in the Strip to feed everyone for 3 months. Really? That changed very quickly, literally from one day to the next, as soon as the ceasefire went into effect. Does anyone else think that's kind of suspicious? Since we're on the subject of food shortages, I would like to invite you to watch a short video about the many families in Israel who VFI, Vision for Israel, is assisting in this time of financial trouble. The economy is expected to get a bounce with the end of the war, and that's great, but there are many people who need help now. So please watch, and God bless you, and go to our website at visionforisrael.com.
When we go out to the distributions, we just are enjoying to see the people when they come to us and they are so grateful. It's one thing to look at lists of names and all the people coming, but when we see them and when they come and when they sit there and then they meet us, we get to talk to them. We get to learn about their families and their needs beyond what we're giving them. That is the greatest expression of our faith in God and who Yeshua is for us, because if it wasn't for him being the provider for this organization, we wouldn't have what we have to give out. And the greatest of this is to give it with love. And that is our logo. That is our motto, to do it joyfully, to do it with love. We always like when we come together, the staff, make sure that when you go, you're cheering them up. It's not just the giving of the voucher, it's the giving of the spirit, to lift them up spiritually, to let them know that there are people behind them, that the support that we give is not just money, but it's much more than that. And that is our prayer, is for the spiritual and the physical restoration for our people.
We've now provided over 300,000 brand new school packs with their supplies inside for school children of all ages, but particularly the first and second grades. I just love it when we distribute and when a little child comes up and just hugs you on the leg or gives you a big hug and says thank you. And sometimes they may even have a runny nose. I think it's like one of the cutest things. It melts my heart so much. And I'm going, wow, I hope that when they grow up to be an adult and maybe they've been through the army and university and they have a profession, maybe that memory will stay with them for all those years and decades. And one particular event that we host every year is during the reading of the book of Esther. It's a holiday called Purim, a Jewish holiday. And we host about 400 victims of terror attacks every year with their families and the children. We set up arcades and we have like drumming, bongo lessons and basketball shooting, jumping on a trampoline. I love to get involved in the midst of the children and do the very same. I think that's what Yeshua was dwelling on in Scripture when he said to be as little children. And he said also in Matthew chapter 25, we read in the Gospels that when you've done it to the least of these my brethren, you've done it unto me. Now, I want to continue the tradition of ending with some good news. The president of Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto, was scheduled to visit Israel on Tuesday, which would make him the second head of state to visit in just 2 days. But later on Monday evening, it was reported that he'd been spooked by the media coverage and backed out. However, I believe that there could be only one reason why he'd even be planning a trip to Israel, and that would be because he was going to announce that Indonesia is ready to become the next Muslim-majority country to join the Abraham Accords. Most of the negotiations must already be completed if things had gotten this far. So remember that just before Hamas's surprise attack of October 7, 2023, it was widely reported that Saudi Arabia was very close to signing the Abraham Accords, or Avraham Accords. Many analysts believe that Hamas launched its attack in no small part because they wanted to derail this process. It's possible, and maybe even likely, that Subianto was on his way to Jerusalem when he was told that Saudi Arabia wanted to go first and he needed to wait. As we watch the simmering hostility against Israel being expressed in street demonstrations over the Western world this past week, an expansion of the Abraham Accords is definitely something to pray about. Well, with that, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition, a happy edition of VFI News from Israel. God bless you, God bless America, God bless Israel, all of you. Shalom, shalom.